Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian pacifist, knew what he was talking about when he said that strength does not come from winning, your struggles develop your strengths. On this time travel, I want to remember the underdogs. The thousands of ordinary men and women who have battled against the odds. From the defiant convicts who gave birth to the spirit of a nation, to the modern-day warriors fighting for their homes, all the way back to my own family's struggles.
It still makes me sad, and a bit angry too.
In the quest for a better life, history's battlers never give up. This is Cataract Gorge, just outside Launceston in the north of Tasmania. For 40,000 years, it was a hunting ground and meeting place for the local Letamorena people. And today, Aboriginal elder Patsy Cameron is giving me a taste of the traditional food that's still on offer.
Oh,
You got one?
I've got one. It's only a little one.
Hey!
It's very active.
Look at this little fella.
Imagine it's like a sausage with the skin on the outside and yummy flavour on the inside.
He does
Tony.
feel a bit like a sausage.
I've actually found one the last time I was here, Tony, and I actually got my mother to cook it for us this morning. She cooks them, and I want you to just pull it apart.
It's fun, isn't it? There's no reason why I should be freaked by this at all. This is purely cultural, but the thought of it just does make me feel... Oh!
Yeah, just eat a little piece, chew it off, and chew it for a little bit.
There's no reason why I shouldn't eat this like a chocolate bar, but I've got an overwhelming desire to spit it out. If I say cut, they'll never know that I've gobbed it out, will they? Cut. Actually, the residual taste is quite nice. It's like a hazelnut.
You're very brave for doing that.
Thank you very much.
But my questionable bravery pales into insignificance when you consider what it's taken for Pat's people to survive. In the early 1800s, Van Diemen's Land, as the island was known back then, was truly the end of the world from a European perspective. Some of the worst atrocities committed in colonial Australia happened here. I suspect in large part because of its remoteness. Aboriginal people were massacred, women were abducted, and children enslaved.
Although at one time there might have been, what, maybe 500 indigenous people here, and then...
Then came the deliberate action by the British, who declared war on the people in 1828. There was martial law declared to drive the people from the land and to kill them.
After putting up the stiffest resistance to the British recorded anywhere in Australia, the Tasmanian Aborigines were virtually wiped out.
But thankfully, however terrible it was, there are survivors like yourself.
Absolutely. And I trace my lineage to Manalagena, who died on the 4th of December 1835.
And he was a resistance leader?
He was a fighter. He was a mighty warrior. He was a very spiritual man. And Nimirani is Manalagena's daughter. And it's through the women, about 12 women, that the present-day Tasmanian Aborigines can trace their heritage.
And you've got kids?
I've got 4 children and I've got 9 grandchildren.
It's great to know that those stories and those experiences are going to carry on. Thanks ever so much for sharing all that with me. It was
Thank
really
you,
interesting.
Tony. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I'll
Thank
never
you.
forget the little grub as long as I live.
I'm glad.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Tony.
2 centuries ago, Pat's forebears gave their lives in defence of their bountiful homeland. But while Aboriginal people were the first to try to protect Australia from rampant development, they certainly weren't the last. Next, I'm travelling forward 150 years when another group of battlers took it up to the authorities in order to save their homes. In the early 1970s, Sydney was in a building boom. And century-old houses were making way for new high-rise blocks. In the working-class suburb of Woolloomooloo, a street fight erupted over the demolition of inner-city terraces. Surprisingly, the resistance was led by the Builders Labourers Federation, an organisation whose members would normally benefit from development. Except in this case, they saw the bigger picture. But the BLF, or at least the New South Wales branch of the BLF, decided that its members would no longer work on these multi-million-dollar developments unless a lot of affordable housing was put in, unless local people were consulted, and unless beautiful old buildings like this one put up in 1853 were protected. Their leader, Jack Mundy, declared, "We will not just become robots directed by developer builders. More and more, we will determine which buildings we will build." But although the BLF was central to the campaign, it was local people who kicked it off.
This is where it started. This was the first house that was pulled down about 1971.
So what we're seeing now is a rebuild?
A rebuild. There was a corner shop here, owned by, I forget who it was owned by, but it went, and this is where we all came down on the next day when they were attempting to pull it down more, and then there were the women, myself and others who were trying to stop the bulldozers from operating. We couldn't stop them, but that was the catalyst to start then of the Woolloomooloo Resident Action Group, yes.
And what was it that you actually wanted?
We wanted this area here for low-income families.
Yeah.
But you see, so close to the city, so close to everything else, they wanted it for other purposes. If you have a look around, all of this was saved.
None of this stuff would have been here.
Exactly right.
The combined community and union action became known as the Green Bands. And they saved many heritage buildings and open spaces all around Sydney, including this iconic wharf on the harbour. It's called Finger Wharf, and it's supposed to be the largest timber-piled wharf in the world. And it kind of marks the change in Woolloomooloo from being a genteel suburb into something much more gritty and industrial. Loads and loads of wool passed in and out of here, and thousands of soldiers in 2 world wars. In fact, it was to here that the prisoners of war from Japan returned at the end of World War II. It was also the first glimpse generations of migrants had of their new Australian home. But after 70 years of faithful service, the state government decided to demolish it in the 1980s. So once again, the unions and the people banded together. Which is great. It's a lovely place. And now, ironically, it's a buzzing enclave for the beautiful people. But despite all the glamour and the celebrity and the fancy restaurants, at least there's still public access. And every day people come down here to do a spot of fishing. And I rather like that. Australia's trade union movement has a long and proud history, starting with the introduction of the 8-hour day in 1856. I'm now time-travelling back to the 1820s to reveal the nation's first ever recorded industrial action. But the battlers behind that struggle are not who you might think. In the 1820s, Parramatta was the administrative heart of the British penal colony in New South Wales. Home to government buildings, churches and schools, it was a bastion of order and control amidst the chaos of a colonial society. In 1821, a new institution appeared on the horizon. It was called the Female Factory, a state-of-the-art facility to house the hundreds of women sent to Australia in chains. This is what the Female Factory would have looked like in the 1820s. Very interesting room just there. It was a meeting room, and it's where men would come who were on the lookout for wives from among the female prisoners who were getting near to the end of their sentence. Over there, that was the hospital. In other words, that was the first female health service in the entire colony. And behind us, up there, was the dormitories. That building was knocked down in the 1880s, but you can still see remnants of it in that bell and the clock there being incorporated into that later tower. So you can see that although there have been a lot of changes, there are echoes, shadows of that original 1820s building still all around today. The building's beautiful architecture were meant to inspire orderly behaviour among the female convicts. But instead, they turned out to be the scene of a historic riot. What went wrong?
The women were being treated, like criminals. But also they were treated as if they had no morals, that they were just lazy prostitutes. And they weren't that way at all.
A lot of them were quite smart, weren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, we have machine breakers, we have women who were able to do great forgeries, women who really brought lots of trades with them, 180 trades they brought with them.
So political activists and high-end criminals were coming here?
Absolutely.
These weren't just victims?
Absolutely. No, they might have been incarcerated, but victims they definitely weren't.
In 1827, things came to a head when the women's already meagre food rations were cut down.
Tell me about the riot.
Right, well, riot is a question in itself. If you're looking from above, perhaps it's a riot, but for the women it was about a workers' action.
Yeah, let's call it workers' action.
Yes, I think we should. It was a point where the women were fed up. There was corruption here, they weren't being treated well, they didn't like what was happening in terms of the head shaving punishments and also the yoking, so what they decided was they'd had enough. And when Matron Rain cut the rations, there was a mini riot on the Wednesday. They threw out a constable, and that was sort of the beginning of what was to come.
2 days later, the angry, starving women grabbed their pickaxes, broke down the doors and busted out of the joint. They rampaged through the town, grabbing any food they could find.
So tell me about the Spartacus moment. That's my favourite part of this story.
The Spartacus moment, well, when the women did come back, eventually most of them came back. They were lined up, and Major Lockyer, who was head of the constabulary at the time, said, I want to get the ringleaders and I want to put them in their cells. And all the women that were there said, no, we're standing together. And I think that's really part of the Australian character.
I am Spartacus. I am Spartacus.
Yes, absolutely.
The solidarity of Australia's female convicts didn't just help them overcome the injustice of the penal system. It also paved the way for future generations of Aussie battlers.
So a lot of these working-class women, smart political activists, they're influencing their kids in a way that possibly in a lot of other countries wasn't happening.
Absolutely. I often think of them as the quiet revolution. They're passing it down from mother to child, and it's a really important part of who we are, but we don't recognise it.
The strength of these Australian mothers reminds me that for so many people doing it tough, the personal is political. Indeed, this was the case for my own family members, who I'm about to visit on my final time travel back to the mid-19th century, when they were struggling to survive. I've come back to my roots in London, on the trail of my own family's battlers. In the late 19th century, London was a city in flux. Industrialisation had brought Britain vast wealth, but along with it came devastating social upheaval. The problem was that London hadn't yet built the infrastructure to cope with the huge increase in population, including immigrants from across the globe, that accompanied the massive growth in trade. It led to poor working conditions, overcrowding and high crime rates. In a word, life was grim, and many of the areas associated with my family's history in the East End of London faced extreme poverty. And extreme poverty meant the poorest ended up in local workhouses. There was no comfort in these places. Families were split up, accommodation was overcrowded, and sanitation was awful. They were said to be worse than prisons. This building was one of those workhouses. Few people walking past today would realise its dark secret, but it's particularly significant to me. It was where my great-grandfather died.
He'd been a box cutter, so I suppose he was a forerunner of all those guys over there with their different skills. But when he died, the census return didn't say box cutter, it said pauper patient. He was only 39. And he left behind my great-grandmum, Julia, and she moved back in with her mum. She was a dressmaker, but clearly it didn't work out because she died in the workhouse as well. Not this one, another one just round the corner. There were a lot of them around at that time. And it's funny, it was a very long time ago, but it still makes me sad and a bit angry too.
The bit that makes me angry is the fact that there was plenty of work during those times. Business was booming.
Even when I was in my early teens, there were loads of factories around here where my great-grandfather could have plied his trade as a box cutter. There was Clarnico's sweet factory just down the road, and there was this one, absolutely massive, the Brian and May Match Company. Jerry, if there were so many job opportunities available to him, why do you think he had such a hard time?
The short answer is that people were paid very little. Wages were very low, especially for those at the lower skilled end of the market, where there were so many workers around that employers just had a huge labour pool to choose from.
I had this book made up about my ancestors, and it's the census record for my great-grandmother. And look, there she is, Nancy Levy, the mum, dressmaker. Sarah Stevens, in the same house, dressmaker. It's her daughter, dressmaker. Julia Corduroy, my great-grandma. All of them dressmakers, all in the same house.
Well, it's no surprise to find in a very poor street like Jersey Street, Bethnal Green, large numbers of dressmakers. The poor needlewomen of London had been really a national scandal since the 1840s. There had been cases in the times of women starving to death.
So people were really living on the edge?
They were living really hand-to-mouth.
Then, as now, there was one force in society that helped raise the poor and oppressed from a life of desperation and despair. That force was education. And in the late 19th century, it came to East London in the form of a unique philanthropic venture. Eton College, the famous boys' school that was the favourite in aristocratic circles, decided they wanted to make a difference. They purchased some land in the east of London and set about creating a sporting nirvana for the poverty-stricken locals. They felt like missionaries exploring deepest, darkest East London. It was thought that the moral force of a gentleman's company would benefit the locals. Condescending perhaps, but membership of the Eton Manor clubs soon became a badge of honour, as some of the old boys will testify.
What was so great about Eton Manor?
The camaraderie. Yeah, everyone was accepted.
Why did you want to have that membership so much?
It was an achievement to get into the club. You know, you were on an elevated level if you were a member.
The club was so highly recognised by everybody in the area, and you were proud to become a member.
There were old Etonians that founded the club. The things that they brought with them, like social awareness, leadership skills, a genuine respect for legitimate authority, it seemed to sort of rub off onto you, you know what I mean? It was like no other. You can't believe what it was like. It was so warm, caring and loving in that way.
Instilling discipline and respect were high on the agenda. If you wanted the benefits of the club, you had to abide by its rules. For the swimmers, that meant turning up on an icy Christmas morning for a race across the canal.
It was a fantastic spectacle to see it all going.
And you won it.
I won it one year.
Congratulations. Did you get a turkey?
I got a chicken that year.
A chicken? Chicken doesn't sound much nowadays, does it?
Chicken was valuable. When you went to a wedding in those days, it was a posh wedding, you told people they had chicken. So to win a chicken was quite an achievement.
And do you remember when we went to the Isle of Thorns? I mean,
I'm going to leave you lot to reminisce.
Thank you.
Ta-da.
Cheers,
let's stay.
Turns out my own family was also touched by the philanthropy of Eton's best.
My dad went to Eton Manor, but he only lasted a couple of days. He was a little guy, just like me, and he went there because he wanted to learn how to box. But he'd had a really bad accident. He went to Homerton Hospital because he'd got ringworm in his head, and they gave him some kind of X-ray treatment, but something went wrong with it. I think they kept him under for too long or something. He went home that night, and he woke up in the middle of the night and he was screaming, and all the hair had come out of his head and it was lying on the pillow, and it never grew back again. So ever after that, he had to wear a wig, and that was his nickname, Wiggy. So he went into the boxing ring with this other little lad, and they started sparring about, and the other lad gave my dad just a glancing blow, but it hit him just on the side of his head, and his wig went flying off, and it went right out the ring. And then my dad turned back, and the other guy went boff and knocked my dad out. And he never went back to Eton Manor again, which I think is a bit of a shame, really.
With reforms in education and working conditions, life gradually improved for the bulk of London's poor, including that of my own family. 3 generations after the tragic death of my great-granddad, life's very different for me and my kids. A precious gift from my forebears, who, despite everything, never gave up. On this time travel through struggle and hardship, I've seen the lengths that history's battlers will go in order to give their families and communities a better future. From the warriors who defended the homes of their people, to the women whose examples lived on in their children's lives, each individual act of strength and determination has not just transformed the lives of their loved ones, but together, they've changed history as well.
Hi, I'm Tony Robinson.
If you love my show and want to see some more amazing history stories, then please hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and we'll let you know when there's something new to watch. Enjoy.